Welcome learners to this session on planning process. In the previous sessions, we have till now discussed about the concept of planning, the characteristics of planning, advantages, and we also highlighted the various types of plans which are available to any manager. The learning objectives of this session is that end of this session you will be able to identify the various steps that are involved in the planning process. You will also be in a position to discuss the contribution of each stage in the planning process. We will also identify various possible planning pitfalls, and towards the end we will explain what are the various limitations of planning. Dear students, you know that planning can be viewed as an approach to problem solving. So whenever any organization establishes certain goals to be achieved, or there are any problems which are to be solved, planning comes handy and is one of the tools that can be used by the management and the managers that help the organization to achieve the goals or solve any problem which the team or the department or organization as a whole is facing. We all know that planning provides a systematic way of viewing the problems and then go ahead and develop both the short-term as well as the long-term solutions. Since it is a systematic way of solving problem, therefore planning is considered to be one of the very important management functions. There are various steps which are involved in the planning process. We have divided these steps under 8 broad categories. So under step 1, we will be highlighting about the concept of perception of opportunities, which is the first step in any planning process. Then comes that the team or the manager has to establish certain objectives which are to be met. Based on that, the planning premises is undertaken, which provides enough inputs to the managers to identify various alternatives, which comes at step number 4. So at step number 4, once all the alternatives have been identified, we move on to step number 5, where the identified alternatives are then evaluated based on certain predefined criteria. The evaluation is done in such a way that each of the alternatives should be in a position to achieve the objectives which have been defined at step number 2. So after the evaluation process is completed, at step number 6, an appropriate choice is taken that which of these alternatives will be then picked up for subsequent implementation. So we will be highlighting what are the various concerns that should be kept in mind. At step number 7, the supporting plans are then formulated. These supporting plans are very essential, which will ensure that the implementation part is well taken care of. And finally, at step number 8, the sequence of activities which will follow during the implementation are established. Now let us look at each of these steps in detail. We will start with step number 1, which pertains to the perception of opportunities. Dear students, remember that before any task is undertaken, it is always a good idea to have a preliminary look at all the possible opportunities which exist within a particular environment. The ability to see them clearly and completely as well as having the knowledge of strengths and weaknesses of the organization, as well as the vision of the organization, is what is expected to be gained. Now, this is very important because for any manager, the manager should have a good understanding of the vision of the organization, should understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of the organization, and you should be creative enough to look into the future and identify what are the various opportunities which are available to the firm which can be exploited. So therefore, the planner needs to ask a number of questions at this stage. Asking questions will definitely help the manager to clarify the context, the situation, and also will help them to define the problem that the organization is confronting. So what are these questions that should be asked? The first question that can be asked is, what is the main problem of concern? What is that issue that is actually confronting the manager, the department, or the entire organization? Once you identify that, second important question that should be asked is, why do you think that it is a problem? Because once you start finding answer to this issue, you will be able to identify the possible causes. Then at the third step, you need to ask the following question. Are existing resources available to eliminate the problem? So in case if there is any issue that is being confronted by the organization, it's important to ask whether there are in-house resources available or not. Then at the fourth stage, you need to ask, is there any other organization or any agency or your competitor which is also trying to solve the same problem? And finally, if you also find the answer to this question, that how severe is the problem, that will surely give a very good insight to any team in terms of understanding the overall context under which the organization is operating. This is very important because once the problem is been identified, based on that comes step number 2. Step number 2 pertains to establishing the objectives. Again, within this, there are certain questions that should be asked which will definitely help anyone to clarify various issues. Number 1, you need to find answer to this question, that what is it to be done? Ultimately, what is the future state that you are looking for? Where the primary emphasis is to be placed? And also find the answer to this question, what is to be accomplished by the various types of plans that are being formulated. It's always a good idea to remember that the objectives are written best if they are smart. In other words, if you establish smart objectives, then the task becomes much more clear, and the way in which plans would ultimately get implemented will definitely ensure success of the organization. Now, what do we mean by smart objectives? Here the word S stands for specific, that the objectives should always be very specific, because if you have very vague objectives, the team which is given the task to implement it will never be sure about what is to be achieved. M here stands for measurable. Always remember that it should be made possible to quantify what is to be achieved. So measurability becomes a very important aspect of the SMART objectives. A here stands for area specific, or in other words, we also say that they should be achievable. Area specific here means that the objectives should primarily concern with the goal, They should not deviate from what the broader vision and mission of the organization is. And when we say achievable, it means that objectives which are defined should also be achievable by the team that is made responsible for the implementation of plans and achievement of objectives. R here stands for that the objectives should be realistic, which means a good planner should have a good thorough understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the team, of the organization. What are the resources that are available at disposal? In case the resources are not available in-house, does the organization have enough capability to procure these resources in an economical way? And finally, the T aspect of SMART is that the objectives should be time bound, which means a time frame should be surely given to the objectives so that the person who is achieving the objectives also understands that how much time do I have in order to achieve these objectives. In step 3, which pertains to planning premises, is very important. Planning premises is nothing but our planning assumptions. Now, assumptions of what? Assumptions of two broad things. One is the external factors, which we also call as the external premises, and number 2 pertains to the internal factors. When we talk of the external premises, this includes total factors in the task environment, which means under what environment is the organization actually operating. Now, this will include various factors like the political landscape of the country or of the region where you are operating. The social factors will have a direct implication on the planning aspect. How is the technology evolving in your industry? Or in case if the technology is evolving somewhere else, how the technology will ultimately impact your business? That is to be understood. Who are your competitors? Where are they located? What are their plans? What have been their actions in the past is another factor which the planner should have good understanding about. And finally, in addition to these factors, the planner should have a thorough updated information on the government policies. Not only aware about the present policies, but should also understand whether they will be in a position to influence the policies, what are the policies which are coming in the future, and how they will really impact the business. Once the external premises are undertaken, the next task is to understand the internal factors. Now, what are these factors? This include the organization's policies, what have been the policy in the past, what is the broad vision of the organization, what is the mission, what are the various types of resources which are available with the organization, and whether the organization has the ability to withstand the environmental pressures. Understand that external environment will always impose certain challenges to the organization. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic in fact affected all the organizations, but only those organizations which were able to withstand the pressure ultimately survive the crisis. So once the premises is done, at step number 4, the task is to identify various alternatives. Now, the concept of various alternatives basically suggests that any given objective can be achieved through various actions. As we know that there is always more than one option which is always available to the managers that can help them to achieve a particular objective. In this step, the task of the planner is to creatively think of as many alternatives as possible. Here the creativity and the capacity of the planner to think differently comes into a play. So the planner, if not capable of generating alternatives, should always engage in brainstorming session. Many a times good ideas can flow from your teammates, good ideas can flow from your customers, good ideas can flow from your channel partners or any other stakeholder. Remember, at this stage when you are generating alternatives, please do not evaluate the options, because the moment you start evaluating the options, there is always a chance that you may leave out that alternative which can possibly give you the best result. So remember, at step number 4, the task is to create a long list of all the possible options which are now available to the manager, which can help to achieve the organizational goals and objectives. So once all the alternatives have been identified, we move on to step number 5. Step number 5 is about evaluating the identified alternatives. So at this stage, the attempt is made to evaluate how each alternative can contribute to the organizational objectives, especially in the light of the resources and constraints that are available with the planner. Right here, each alternative is now compared with all other options. And how this is done? This is done by identifying the criterias on the basis of which the alternatives will be evaluated. So for example, if 5 criterias are identified by the top management team, each of these criteria is then given a weight. So one possibility can be that all criterias are equally important. The second possibility can be that one criteria is 30% important. There could be a criteria which is only 5% important. So on the basis of the level of importance of each criteria, a combined score is calculated for each of these options. So a detailed cost benefit analysis of each alternative must be done, because each alternative will also have certain cost implications. So for a planner, it's very important to understand that what would be the respective cost of the option and whether the gains that you are going to achieve through that particular alternative is really worth the cost of that particular option. So a thorough evaluation of each of the alternatives should be undertaken. Once the evaluation of options is done, we move on to step number 6, which is choice of alternatives. Dear students, evaluation makes comparisons of all the different options in terms of their expected result, which means each of the plan would ultimately help you to achieve a given result. So alternative courses of action is to be undertaken in future, which is not constant. Therefore, a planner must be ready with various alternatives. Normally what we call it as a contingency plan. In other terms, we say it is also known as plan B. Though you have selected the best alternative, no doubt about it, but along with the best alternative, you should always have a contingency plan. Why this contingency plan or plan B is important? It is important because when the real implementation takes place, the future is always uncertain. You do not know that what kind of contingencies might emerge. So if you have a contingency plan in place, it can be implemented without wasting time and resources in the change situation. And this comes quite handy for any organization to sail through the turbulent times. Otherwise, there is a high possibility that at the time of implementation, if you do not have a contingency plan, your entire performance can come to a standstill. At step number 7, the task pertains to the formulation of the supporting plans. While contingency plans are important, in addition to this, there is a need to develop derivative plans. Derivative plans are also known as sub-plans or secondary plans, which help the organization to achieve the main plan. So once the main plan is in place, the word derivative means that all the sub plans or the secondary plans are derived from the main plan, and these derivative plans are always formulated out of the main plan, and therefore they support it. So a broader plan is then broken up into more sub plans, which ensures that there is no mistake which is committed. Everything is planned well in advance in order to ensure that at the time of implementation there is pure perfection. And the contingency plans will support these derivative plans, that in case of any deviation, if any, these contingencies plan will come into play and help the organization. Finally, at step number 8, the task is to establish the sequence of activities. So after formulating the basic and derivative plans, the sequence of activities is determined. So based on the plans at various levels, it can then be decided who will do what and at what time. In addition to this, budgets for various periods can also be prepared to give plan more concrete meaning or implementation. So a good sequence of activities will ensure that the implementation is perfect. So understand that planning process also breaks up into various activities. The corresponding budgets are linked to it, corresponding cost elements are linked to it, and if possible, all the resources that are desired in order to ensure that the plan is done properly is done at this particular stage. Once the planning is done, now let us quickly go through various planning pitfalls. Remember, plan is too complex, that is not good for any organization. A plan which does not align with the goals of the company or the mission of the company will always end up in a disaster. You should ensure that the plan is not too centralized. The delegation and decentralization should always be considered. A plan should never give a false sense of certainty, and any plan which impedes change and adaptation is again not very good. A plan which fails to anticipate competitors' action is a bad plan. And also remember, any plan that does not account for all the important things which are under planning is again bound to fail. A good plan will always be independent of the planner. So just be sure that any plan which is not independent of the planner is again bound to fail. There are various limitations of planning. Planning leads to rigidity. It may not work in the dynamic environment. It can reduce creativity. It definitely involves huge cost. Planning is for sure a time-consuming process, and it does not guarantee success. But even then, one has to plan in order to be sure that there are no risks. So dear students, in this session we have discussed about 1. Various steps in the planning process, contribution of each stage in the planning process. Later, towards the end, we discussed what are the planning pitfalls and also highlighted the limitations of planning. Thank you.